want to welcome everybody here today. I am delighted to see such a full room. Welcome all you members of the press and my supporters. I really appreciate your being here. And citizens who came out of interest or curiosity, welcome to you. Everybody is welcome and thanks. Well, when someone speaks about posterity or those who come after us, these images are vague and they don't really conjure up much of anything. And they certainly don't touch our hearts. And for us Americans, that's been pretty much okay. Because while we have invested to some degree in the future generations, for the most part, we Americans have had the luxury of being able to just focus on building our own good lives. And in that process, we built a great nation. And we could just assume that our children and grandchildren would be able to lead even better lives than we had. Until now, we didn't really have to think much about future generations and what lay in store for them while we went about our business. Well, now all that has changed. And we face some decisions that are absolutely urgent. And these decisions are really more about our children and grandchildren than they are about us. And if we fail to take their best interests, their vital interests to heart, then we will be guilty of one of the worst moral defects, an indifference to the suffering of innocence. And that's why I'm here today. I am trying to make vivid and palpable just all that is at stake here. And I'm trying to help the citizens of our district to feel in their hearts what it means when they go to the polls in November to choose between Mark Obenshain and me. Let me introduce you to my two granddaughters. Please meet Dahlia and Leora. These are the two little girls that I first introduced back in March at my first press conference when I launched my candidacy. These are the little ones that I feel so moved to protect. I mean, look at these sweet faces. I mean, don't you just, I mean, they look so open to all that life has to offer them. And I cannot stand to think of them suffering needlessly because we just couldn't get it together to do what needed to be done to address the climate crisis. It just pains me. So I have to give my best to protect them. And that is really what this challenge of climate change is all about. And here's what the experts have to say about the kind of world that these little girls and millions of others like them, what the world will be like for them if we fail to address this crisis. The world that these little ones and millions of other children will live in will be a place that is much more unstable, where there will be much more warfare if we don't act. The Pentagon itself calls climate change a threat multiplier. By that they mean climate change makes all the other dangers more dangerous. The experts tell us that if we don't act, food and fresh water could well become scarce in the world that these children grow up in if we don't act. And the less we attend to this gathering crisis of climate, the more the sea levels will rise, swamping cities along Virginia's coast and along coastlines throughout the world. The extreme, unpredictable weather that we are starting to see is going to become much more severe and much more frequent. The list goes on. In moral terms, we have really quite a simple choice to make. Will we follow the golden rule, or will we not? For it is by our actions or our inactions that we are doing unto them. Just as surely as if we were to gather these little ones into our arms to protect them or push them off into onrushing danger. The golden rule requires us to ask this question. If we were in their position, and if we were depending on the people in our position to protect us, to keep our vital interest in mind, how would we want them to protect us? How would we want them to do unto us? Would we want them to do unto us as Mark Obenshain is consistently doing in serving the short-term profit interests of his corporate sponsors at the expense of all these little children who are depending on us to protect them? Or would we want them to do unto us as I am calling on us to do now? Well, from what I can tell from Mark Obenshain's record, he is serving the fossil fuel interest, the Koch Industries, Dominion Power, the coal companies, at the expense of our future and of our grandchildren's future. Another clue as to who Mark Obenshain is serving can be seen in the last election. The Koch brothers gave Mark Obenshain $60,000 in that last election. $60,000. Now, the Koch brothers are well known for their efforts to misinform the public when it comes to the dangers of climate change. The Koch brothers have made every effort to block responsible action to deal with the climate crisis. Because why would they do that? They want us to stay addicted to the product that these billionaires are selling. Well, what would the Golden Rule have us do? Would the Golden Rule have us support Mark Obenshain, whom the Koch brothers have identified as their guide to advance their agenda? Would the Golden Rule have us re-elect a state senator who has opposed incentives for fossil fuel companies to cut back on the emissions that are destabilizing our climate? Well, to the citizens of this district, I say, if you follow the Golden Rule with respect to all these innocents who are depending on us to protect them, then it's clear that I am your candidate.
All right.
Yay!
You didn't realize you'd get a standing ovation when you walked in, did you? Not to embarrass you. And I'm not calling on us to make huge sacrifices. It would be a good start if we would simply stop the lying about the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And second, we need to seize the opportunity that this crisis is offering us. We need to make the necessary transition away from dirty, harmful, toxic fossil fuels to embrace this new energy alternatives, of renewable, green energy alternatives. And contrary to what Dominion Power and its buddy Mark Obenshain seem to think, our best future lies not in resisting this change, but in leading it.
Right on.
Now, since when? Since when does America leave it to other countries to create the solutions for our future? And since when does America turn its back on challenges rather than embracing our powerful American ingenuity to deal with crisis? Now just think of what this nation did when we responded to the great challenge of World War II. We mobilized to meet that challenge. We harnessed our great economy and our national will, and we won that war. And in just a handful of years, through the Manhattan Project, we solved enormous scientific and technological problems to create the atomic bomb. And we prospered. Well, now our way forward is being blocked by the big money interests that do not want our nation to adjust to these new realities. And our way forward is being blocked by politicians like Mark Obenshain, who are willing to help these big fossil fuel interests, even if it means sacrificing our future and our grandchildren for short-term profits. Well, isn't it time that we get rid of such politicians and elect leaders who care about more than their own short-term gain?
Yeah.
time that we elect leaders who will act out of love for all of these innocents who are so dependent on us to protect them. And isn't it time to replace Mark Obenshain with me as the Senator of Virginia's 23rd District? Well, thank you, everyone. And I would like to open it up to questions or comments from the press. And then as soon as they've had their say and their questions, then I'd like to have discussion and comments from everybody. Anyone from the press? Yes, Bob?
What kind of program would you propose if you were elected to get away from the fossil fuels?
What kind of program would I support if I were elected? Well, for starters, I would revive a bill that was an excellent piece of legislation that was introduced in our most recent General Assembly. This is a bill, by the way, that never made it out of Mark Obenshain's committee. Mark Obenshain helped kill it. This was a bill called the Coastal Protection Act. And this bill would, it would have the big fossil fuel polluters purchase allowances. So it's kind of a cap and trade idea. They could trade with other companies, so if they needed less, they could sell off their allowances to others. So it would be a cap and trade way to approach it, and then with that money that the state would take in, we could do several things. We could do a restoration of the Virginia coast to make it stronger and more protected from storm surges. We could use some of that money to retrain coal workers in Southwest Virginia, and we could put some of that money into energy renewables. That bill, this would have us, if we pass this bill, we would be the 9th state to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We would be one of 9 states. The other states who are already in that initiative have had great success. They have reduced their carbon footprint a great deal, and electricity prices in those states have fallen 8% over the years since 2008 when that was introduced, whereas rates overall nationwide have risen 6%. So that would be a great start. That's what I would start with.
Whose bill was that?
Who authored that bill? I'd have to get back to you on that. Other questions, comments? Yes, Elena?
I spoke with Mr. Obenshain recently, and he had told me that some groups would like to see coal eradicated, and he said he doesn't believe that that's, at this point, in Virginia's best interest. And when he spoke about renewables, he had said that there's a temptation to incentivize conversion from traditional energy to renewable energy without regard to that cost to consumers. Can you talk about how you would try to effectively make that transition from traditional to renewable energy in a way that balances the bill so it doesn't ultimately go to consumers?
Okay, yes. Well, we absolutely have to make a transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Our future and our grandchildren's future depends on it. And I am concerned about the jobs of people working in the coal industry. And that's one of the best things about this Coastal Restoration Act, is that it includes funding to retrain workers. You know, Mark Obenshain might say he's for small government, but he voted for extending tax credits to the coal companies through 2019. And you know, this is big government. And Virginia taxpayers have already, over the last 20 years, spent $500 million shoring up the coal industry. I mean, we have to move on. We do have to take into consideration the jobs that people might lose. But already in the solar industry, there are twice as many people working in the solar industry now as working in the coal industry. Wow. So these are great jobs. They are career jobs. These are jobs we need more of, and there is much more demand for these jobs. Done? Oh, is anyone else from the press want to ask a question?
Wouldn't that primarily, though, what you're talking about, wouldn't that primarily be, a lot of this be done through the EPA and the federal, if you were like a congressperson as opposed to a state legislator? I mean, primarily a congressperson could go to the EPA or introduce federal legislation that would affect the entire country. I'm just guessing that would be more sweeping, encompassing type of reform.
Well, we all have a role to play here. There's a state role, there's a federal role, there are local roles. And we have seen how much resistance there is to the federal government. I mean, here, just with the Medicaid expansion, here are these free dollars coming to Virginia that our legislature won't even accept. So it's not as if the EPA or the federal government can do everything. A lot of things they try to do, they can't succeed. The Clean Power Plan, which the EPA is implementing, is a good first step toward dealing with emissions from coal plants, from fossil fuel plants. And there's a lot of resistance to it here in Virginia, but we need to go on that front. But people like local solutions, and they're important because things are particular to local areas. So we need our own state solutions, and we need local solutions as well as federal.
If I could be really, any other press, right?
Anyone else from the press have a comment or question?
If I can be really concrete for some of the press questions that have just been asked. I'm sorry that I'm late here.
That's all right.
I was dashing here on my bike, and it's raining. But the interesting thing is, the reason I stopped was because I ran into a fellow who is striping pavement out in front of Klein's Dairy Bar. And I had to have a talk with him about what binder he had used in the sealer that was put down. And the binder, I'm telling you, was coal tar binder. And we're facing a worst-case scenario right here. That's going to wash straight into Black's Run, and you watch if we don't have enough rain, if we don't have a fish kill downstream in Black's Run. That's why that stuff is being banned everywhere. This is exactly the worst-case scenario. And I talked to this guy who looks like, I mean, he's working hard for his money.
Yeah.
And he told me he doesn't do the sealing because it makes him sick. And he's exactly right, it's making him sick. So in terms of the costs, there are some costs that are not factored in. And let me tell you, those kids there would be even sicker by that stuff. And in terms of jobs, it's just a hair-thin margin of profit that they're making using the coal tar over what they're using in California, with asphalt. And they're just scrambling for that hair-thin margin. When you add in the subsidies and the fact that it's waste, its cost isn't being considered, this is not the market working correctly. And finally, in terms of local solutions, Alice Rivlin spoke at JMU, some of the press may have covered her recently, on health and healthcare. And her message to us was that the place for the solutions is going to be in the state legislatures and in the city councils, because the problems are all local when we really get the rubber meeting the road. For example, in California, they don't use coal tar. So we can't get a national consensus to do a nationwide ban.
I got one other follow-up
Yes,
question.
Bob, yes.
I just came from a meeting at the Greater Augusta Chamber this morning, and they had the Virginia Economic Development Partnership there this morning. And just in that region down there, there's something on the order of about $800 million in export impact. And then in Virginia, one of the largest export clients is China. And what they're exporting is coal from Virginia. Couldn't that